I am going through my phase of being obsessed with vampires again. I feel like everyone goes through this phase at some point in their life, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I never left. I started this phase when I was a teenage, like even younger, I think. And I just have stayed on this vampire bandwagon for pretty much up until this point.
I currently become obsessed with What We Do in the Shadows. And
it's so good.
Yes, it's so good. And it's also so gay, which I love.
Very gay.
Yes.
In a way that's just natural too. That feels it's just part of the show. And I just want to say like up front too, like I'm a gay man, so I feel like I can speak on some of these things, but it's nice to like actually have it done in a nice way, and it works with vampires.
Exactly. That reminded us of how vampires have been portrayed in fiction. Vampires have always been very sexualized and taboo. A lot of times their lust for blood is a metaphor for repressed desires.
From Gordon Melton, who wrote the Encyclopedia of the Undead, which is this fantastic book all about vampires and trends and vampires and sexuality and the evolution of vampires. And what he said is that, especially with Bram Stoker, now we had seen sexuality with vampires before, like with people like Carmilla and Lord Ruthven. They were sexual vampires, but they weren't necessarily, like, eroticism wasn't necessarily the main pull of the story. And it wasn't really until Dracula. And with Dracula, Gordon writes that Stoker revealed the full impact of the psychosexual connotations involved in the relationship between vampire and victim, showing a striking similarity between bloodlust of the undead and the repressed carnality of mere mortals. Sex on the mortal's part is an allegory for the bloodlust of the vampire.
Definitely. And it's always been these monsters where you're talking about either Frankenstein's monster, werewolves, and of course vampires. It's always about othering.
Yes.
And I think that's why, at least you and I and a lot of people we know are very sympathetic to monsters.
Yes.
Is because of their othering. You do feel for them. And especially in Gothic lit, there's a fear of vampires, especially in these works. Unlike when we get to the 2000s with Twilight, where there's just desire. You're not scared of these vampires.
Yeah, it's been an interesting shift because with the Gothic vampires in particular, that all came from people's fear of the dead and their misconceptions of body decomposition. And so that's how the real world like vampire myth started. And then had early vampires, even before Dracula, who hammered in this idea of the sexual vampire. And then, of course, we had the Catholic Church that jumped onto things like witches and vampires and made them almost, I would say, even more attractive by making them forbidden.
Yeah, exactly. The Gothic novel Carmilla, which came out in 1872, tells the story of a teenager, Laura, and her encounter with a vampire, Carmilla, and it starts the monster romance. The relationship between the two women, it's a threat to male power in this traditional scope of the 19th century. And even Laura's father sees the vampire Carmilla as an evil, as the other, because she's corrupting the conditions of society. And also the relationship empowers his daughter and robs him of the power he has over his daughter.
And that's what it always comes down to, is the power dynamics and who you have control over. And the second that somebody starts to become sexually liberated is when you start to lose your control over someone, even if it's not directly connected through sex. You know what I'm saying?
And if you just think about like what vampires are, it's all about exchanging bodily fluids. So that's a very sexual metaphor right there. And if you think about also like how vampires at the start of film, how they're portrayed, they're very much horrific. Right?
Yeah. Nosferatu type, like really tall, bald, long fingers, very scary.
Yes. And it's a reflection of just how society is in their sexual awakening, or how they feel like sex is in the culture. But there's a reason like things like Interview with a Vampire resonates with so many people of the queer community, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And especially, I don't know, Candace, if you have seen the one from the show that's going on right now that just aired, Interview with a Vampire, but it's even gayer than the book and the movie, in which a lot of it was just implied. And I think that ties back to your point of society and sexual understanding and sexual awakening, depending on where we are as prudes, really, when you think about it. Like, I think it was Bela Lugosi's Vampire, his like definitive portrayal of Dracula, that really brought about this idea of kind of the sexual nature of the vampire.
And we get handsome actors like Christopher Lee playing Dracula later on too.
And especially during Christopher Lee's tenure as the Count. That was during the 70s too. The end of the 60s going into the 70s.
Yeah, that was a big sexual awakening.
And not only that, but there was this kind of interesting quote I came across. But it's not just the sexual awakenings that have cued us into the vampire being more of a sexy being and less of a monster, but it's also our experience with multicultural education and enlightenment. Because as we've mentioned before, that the vampire is a direct symbolism, basically, of the other. But after several decades, basically, of multicultural education and enlightenment, we still have so much work to do, but we're starting to learn that the other is less of a sinister villain and more of a victim to sympathize with rather than persecute. So that was the quote I found in this book called Signs of Life, which looks at trends like vampires in media and stuff like that. So I thought that was interesting too, is it's also tied with the more we see in the world too. The more we get exposed to other people, the more our views start to shift and we begin to think less of good and evil and more of, we understand that everything is complex.
Yeah, and that's especially with like Dracula. It's not just because he's a vampire, but he's very foreign to these British people. And also he's also corrupting Nina, a British woman.
He's the Hungarian bad boy. And the Bela Lugosi, I mean, his looks are so distinct and his accent in the film was so distinct that it contributed to being such a memorable performance for Dracula. And I think that was the impression that really started this trend of how we look at these creatures and how we lust after them. Gosh, so much of it is just because we're attracted to them.
I keep going back to my own experience, like lusting for vampires. And that goes to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Which those vampires are humans who've lost their souls. They look like humans until they vamp out, they call it. Yeah. And they have like these brows and they look monstrous. Yeah. But of course, we also have the vampire angel who has his soul.
Yes.
Which he is a broody, handsome man.
And he was one of the first examples of, not the first, but one of the first examples of the vampire kind of morphing into the reluctant guardian, so to speak.
And it's all about like this fighting your nature kind of thing, because he wants to make out with Buffy, but he also wants to kill her. It's also that star-crossed kind of thing where she is a vampire slayer, he's a vampire, which is just a classic trope. We also get Spike in there, who was the one I had a thing for, more so than Angel.
I was going to ask you, are you Team Angel or Team Spike?
I am Team Spike all the way. I don't know why. I could not answer. It's probably the cheekbones, I'm guessing.
Spike was something else. Interesting foil to Angel.
I don't like using Twilight vampires as an example for this at all, because I feel like they are so repressed.
Yeah, very repressed, very straight. I think Twilight has its place, and I'm glad that people like it and stuff like that, but I almost feel like it misses the point of vampirism and vampire stories.
You could see it as a exaggeration of what teens feel. The vampires who are like, Edward is lusting over Bella, and he keeps like, oh no, like he wants to bite her. So it's like how at that age, hormones are just out of control, really.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so it's how like maybe a religious standpoint of it, because Edward and Bella wait until marriage to, one, have sex, two, to turn her into a vampire. So it's like vampires for people with more conservative values.
Christian vampires, yay.
Pretty much. Yeah, so they have their place. Like you said,
and again, it helps that Edward is played by Robert Pattinson.
Yes.
So again, we're casting these really sexy actors in the role, and that's helping the vampire's image as a sex icon, really.
Yeah, I've only seen one or two of the films completely, but like all the vampires there were gorgeous.
They're so beautiful; they glitter in the sunlight.
It's to attract victims, really, right?
Yes. The seduction.
Yes. Which is interesting because before you had these vampires that were hideous and they were just monsters and they would attack. While even Carmilla, who was beautiful, she was very much not the norm for the vampires at the time.
Yes.
But we get that later on is the vampires are temptations for normal everyday humans.
And it brings me back to what you said about Buffy and like, fuck Joss Whedon. But what I will say is that I really like the metaphor of the vampires being these sexy, really good looking. And then as soon as you're alone with them, it's like everything falls away and the predator comes out.
Exactly. And that can be just like a metaphor for being in a abusive relationship.
Exactly. Yeah. It's very multifaceted. There's so many different ways people can connect with vampires and vampire stories. And I think that just contributes to the longevity of the genre. And vampires are forever, literally and figuratively.
What I really like from the past few decades is how vampires have become more of an outright allegory for queerness.
Yes.
More stories, especially in mainstream, to help people with the feeling of othering and making it not so othering.
Yeah.
One of the most recent examples of HBO's series True Blood, where they literally have people say they're coming out of the coffin as vampires. That's just the nail in the coffin, right?
Exactly. How more explicit can you be?
Yeah, and then you have like fanatics.
And the fang bangers.
Yeah, you have those fanatics, and then you have religious fanatics like God hates fangs, and just people speaking out against them while people are scared to come out.
Speaking out, really against homosexuality.
Exactly.
I'm not saying this to throw shade at straight people, but it doesn't make sense for a vampire who's lived as long as they have and who kind of falls away from the binaries and the boundaries of social constructs. It makes sense for them to be queer. Let's just say that. Because, like I said, they have these really long lives. They're falling away from the boundaries and the binaries of what, like, society puts on everybody, which again is why queer people and rebels connect with vampires so much.
And it's not just society, it's also like religion. Obviously, the vampires have to restrict, especially in most of the lore is a reject Christianity because they literally cannot go into a church. They can't be around a cross, holy water, all these kind of things. And that's very much the basis of heterosexual marriage is the only option.
And you can really see that in the earliest vampire tales is the vampire's goal was to corrupt the maiden.
Yes.
And make her turn her back on God.
The majority of the vampire's victims are virginal women.
Yeah. Which, like, that alone should tell you it's propaganda right there.
Yeah. Virginity is a construct. But that's a whole nother video.
Oh my gosh.
That's a whole another video and podcast episode. Yes. That really goes into what we do in the shadows, which I have recently just fallen in love with.
I'm so glad because I love that show. Hearing you talk about it like recently and you being a recent fan is just like reigniting my love of the show all over again.
What we do in the shadows is about 3 vampires, and there's also an energy vampire, but we're going to focus on Laszlo, Nadja, Nandor. They are your traditional vampires. And yes, they do kill people, but we don't really focus on that in the show. We are rooting for them, right, Mac?
Absolutely. I don't care what they do.
We also sympathize with them, and they do nice things for other people and each other, and you feel like they are a weird kind of family in a way.
Yeah, and they've bonded through this because one thing that I think we all need to remember is that being a vampire is literally no fun. All of your friends die, your family, like it's not the best life to lead. You can't help but have some sympathy, especially when they're presented as more like protagonists, like Nandor and Nadja and Laszlo.
And what I found really interesting was how these 3 characters and pretty much every vampires are presented as pansexual. Not made a big deal of. It's just who they are. And the thing is, decades ago with queerness and vampires, it would be part of their evilness, right? But now this is just a normal thing. There is a really great episode where Guillermo, who is the familiar to Nandor, but really he's familiar to all the vampires, I would say, right?
Yes.
He comes out to his family And since this is a mockumentary, there's a lot of like talking head interviews. And he's with Naja and talking about, okay, yeah, my family know I'm gay, and he's so happy. And Naja's like, what's the big deal? Everybody's gay.
I love that.
Guillermo finds out that he is part of the Van Helsing family. And that very much felt like a metaphor for being in the closet.
And struggling with the secret that you can't tell anybody, and especially like the people that you're closest to, which in this case,
Yes.
it would be the vampires, even though they would say they're not close to him. They are.
Yeah, they do love him. And the thing is, he's born this way. He cannot change it. So it was very much something that he is trying to hide. Throughout the whole season, he's hiding vampire bodies because he's slaying them. But to protect his family, though.
Yeah. And sometimes by accident.
Yeah.
Because vampire hunters are just so good at what they do, they can't help it.
Exactly. Yeah, many of the executive producers and writers have said, like Paul Sims says, all of them, all the characters are completely pansexual. Stephanie Robinson, who is a co-executive producer and writer, says it's unremarkable among the characters. It's just the norm for them.
They don't even think to question it.
I think that's something that everybody who is underrepresented wants. They want it to be just like not made a big deal of. It's just how it is, right?
You don't need to look at them. You don't need to make snide comments. You don't need to question your beliefs. It's just like it's normalized. So much so that other people don't even feel threatened by it, which would be a great place if we could be there in our society.
Yeah. And Sims also said vampires are so accepting because they've seen everything, like you said before, Matt. They had a conversation early on in the writer's room is like, would they be prejudiced against something? And they decided no, they lived just so long that everyone seems the same. Also to vampires, humans are just all humans. Who cares what kind of humans they are?
I like that. They don't really differentiate between them.
Yeah. Not that they're saying, okay, they're literal monsters, so they're gay. It feels like they're taking it back and they're owning it.
Yes, exactly.
And showing it in a positive light or normal light even. And being like, back in the day, vampires were queer and evil. Our vampires are just hilarious and are.
Hilarious, messy, fun beings that we really like to watch movies and shows about.
Yes. I think vampire fans and of queer media are just going to get more. There's a few seasons left of What We Do in the Shadows, been ordered, so I can't wait for those.
I feel like we're just going to get more projects, and I think it would be a mistake if we didn't mention First Kill, which was a Netflix original that came out, and unfortunately it was canceled, but it was really good, and I don't want to say like it had some issues, but it was good. It was about a hunter and a vampire falling in love, you know, the classic story. And the vampire has to make her first kill, and the hunter has to make her first kill to basically be accepted as a hunter. And they end up falling in love. There's a Castlevania spinoff coming out, which if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend. And it's animated, and I don't know if you can deal with animated gore.
Do that a little bit better. So definitely.
You might want to check it out. And I love Castlevania because Carmilla is in it, starting in season 2. And oh my God, Candace, she is a queen.
I'm obsessed. Because before I had no knowledge of Gothic lit. I just thought Dracula was the first vampire, and I was like, oh no, lady did it first.
Yep, Carmilla. So much of what Dracula is known for actually came from Carmilla. The ability to turn into different animals and that kind of thing. It's like, we got so much from Carmilla, so give the queen her due.
I feel like she gets forgotten a lot.
Yeah.
Dracula just...
Carmilla, the film that came out in 2020.
I heard about it, but I heard mixed things, and I didn't want to...
very disappointed by it.
Okay, I'm glad I didn't watch it then.
I was disappointed by it because they downplayed the vampiric element of Carmilla so that it was only implied. So what it turned into was they were trying to protect Laura from basically like homosexuality.
Yeah.
And so to me, it just felt very homophobic, which I don't think was the intent of the film, because they did have a relationship. But when you downplay the vampire elements, you're basically stripping the story of what makes the story meaningful, because the vampire is the allegory. So if you take the allegory out, it becomes the thing that you don't want it to be.
Overall, we want to know, who are your favorite vampires? Is it from Lit? Is it a recent vampire that maybe we haven't heard of, which Mac probably has heard of them, but I haven't?
But if I haven't, let me know, because I would love to digest their media.